At its peak, America moved enough timber down wild rivers to rebuild every home in the nation, twice, using nothing but current, muscle, and branded marks hammered into millions of logs. Bangor, Maine alone shipped 9.7 trillion board feet with no roads in sight, and drivers walked on churning one-ton logs for pay that meant risking their lives daily. But how did thousands of men ride this lethal conveyor belt, and why did so many never return? Here's how the biggest hidden gamble in American history began. Bangor, Maine in the mid-1800s was a city built on timber, with as many as 3,000 ships crowding its harbor at once, each waiting for a cargo of logs floated down from forests that stretched 50 to 100 miles inland. Between 1830 and 1890, nearly 10 billion board feet of lumber passed through its port, enough to build every house in America twice over. These weren't small sticks. A single pine log could weigh a ton, and the rivers carried millions each spring. In 1872, the Hudson River saw more than 200 million board feet, over 2 million logs from 18 different companies, rushing downstream together. The St. Croix boom, a vast network of holding pens and sorting channels, processed more than 10 billion board feet between 1856 and 1914. That's the equivalent of 2 million railroad cars, enough to stretch across the continent and back several times. Moving this much timber by horse or ox was impossible, and railroads couldn't reach deep enough into the wild. Only the rivers could handle such a load, but that created chaos. Logs from dozens of companies floated side by side, indistinguishable, except for a unique brand hammered into each end. At the height of the drives, St. Croix registered more than 1,000 different brands. Altering a timber mark was a crime. Log rustling was as real as cattle theft. If you haven't heard this story, subscribe so we can keep uncovering the history they don't teach in school. When the rivers thawed and the log drives began, men known as river pigs stepped onto the floating timber. They came from everywhere, French-Canadian, Scandinavian, Irish, Finnish, drawn by wages that doubled what a lumberjack could earn in the woods. The best of them, the Bangor Tigers, had a reputation that stretched from Maine to Minnesota. Each spring, they worked 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, balancing on rolling logs in water cold enough to kill. Most couldn't swim. Their boots, heavy leather with steel spikes hammered into the soles, bit into slick bark as they moved from log to log. The logs themselves were cut to a strict standard, 13 feet 4 inches long, so they could be sorted and milled efficiently downstream. Camp diaries tell of men who could dance across a river's worth of timber, spinning a log with a flick of the foot, prying jams apart with a cant dog or Peavey. They called it waltzing, but there was nothing graceful about the danger. One slip meant being crushed or swept under, and the river rarely gave a second chance. The river pigs worked in teams, shouting warnings over the roar of water, trusting each other's instincts. Their motto was simple: save the tool, not the man. The pay was high because the risk was higher. Every spring, men vanished beneath the logs and never came back. But for those who survived, the river offered a kind of pride and freedom that couldn't be found anywhere else. Joseph Peavey stood on a Stillwater bridge in 1857, watching drivers battle a stubborn log jam. The old tools, clumsy wooden pries, just couldn't budge the tangled pine. That day, Peavey returned to his forge and hammered out a new solution: a sturdy ash handle, a pivoting iron hook, and a sharp steel spike. With this invention, a single man could grip and spin a 2,000-pound log with surprising control. River driver William Hale gave it the first trial, prying loose a jam that had stumped stronger men. From then on, the Peavey became the river driver's right hand, part lever, part lifeline. The tool's impact was immediate. Where a team once struggled, one skilled driver could guide a log through rapids or twist it free from a pileup. Crews carried Peaveys of every length, from 30-inch handles for quick work to 5-foot poles for leverage in deep water. Peavey Manufacturing, founded in Eddington, Maine, still forges them today, more than 160 years later. There's a story, maybe true, maybe not, that Peavey lost his patent to a friend after a night with too much Medford rum. But the tool itself outlived any paperwork. The Peavey turned brute force into precision and made it possible to move millions of logs down wild rivers, one man and one lever at a time. Spring runoff alone wasn't always enough to move millions of tons of timber. On many streams, the water ran too shallow, the current too weak. So loggers became engineers, building splash dams, temporary wooden barriers that trapped water for weeks. When the gates opened, the river transformed. 8 million board feet could surge downstream in a single release, as happened on Pennsylvania's creeks in 2008. In Kentucky's Red River country, a single dam sent as many as 50,000 logs roaring through the Narrows at once. Oregon alone counted 232 splash dams operating between 1880 and 1957. These structures stretched anywhere from 50 to 300 feet wide, with gates towering 20 feet above the stream bed. Crews cleared obstacles with dynamite, sending shockwaves through the valley and killing fish outright. The unleashed floods scoured riverbeds to bare rock, stripping away gravel and destroying spawning grounds for salmon and lamprey. Bark and debris from the drives choked the water, lowering oxygen and leaving scars that can still be traced in the landscape a century later. Most dams never had fish ladders. The environmental cost was enormous, but the splash dams worked, turning dry creeks into highways, moving millions of logs in a single season. All that power, all that timber, racing downstream at once, set the stage for disaster whenever the river's grip slipped. A single log wedged sideways in the current could halt an entire river. Another log slammed against it, then another, until a wall of timber stretched from bank to bank, water piling up behind. Jam crews scrambled onto the shifting pile, boots biting into wet bark, Peaveys in hand. They searched for the one log, the key log, whose release would free the whole mass. Sometimes it was buried deep, invisible beneath tons of tangled pine. Men balanced on unstable timber, probing, prying, calling out over the roar. When the right log shifted, the jam could explode in an instant. Water and timber surged forward, logs spinning and smashing together, the river reclaiming its flow. Crews had seconds to leap to safety. Diaries described the ground trembling underfoot as thousands of tons of wood broke free. If hand tools failed, the crew called for dynamite. Powder monkeys crawled beneath the jam, set their charges, and ran. The blast sent logs flying, but the river moved again. Every jam was a contest of physics and nerve, with no guarantee of survival. The river always took its due. In 1845, the Ottawa Valley lost more than 80 men in a single season. Newspapers printed lists of the dead, and families waited for news that never came. Drowning was common, most river drivers couldn't swim, and a slip meant vanishing beneath tons of rolling timber. When bodies were found, they were often buried in empty pork barrels along the banks. The makeshift graves marked by a pair of boots hung from a tree. These silent markers reminded every man who passed that the river gave no second chances. To keep the living going, the Wanigan, part kitchen, part bunkhouse, drifted downstream behind the drive. On the Clearwater, these floating lifesavers stretched 115 feet long and nearly 30 feet wide, built on a raft of army pontoons. They carried enough food for weeks, served 4 hot meals a day, and offered tents and blankets for men who finished their shifts soaked and shivering. The Wanigan kept the crew alive, but it couldn't protect them from the river's toll. Rivers that once carried millions of logs now run clear, but their scars remain, visible in forests, invisible in the water's memory. Our landscapes and the risks we accept for progress are never accidental. What we build today leaves its own marks. Subscribe for more untold histories hiding in plain sight.